I actually had a patient recently tell me they were so disappointed to discover that our best drug for Parkinson's was discovered in the 1960s, and it's still the best drug for Parkinson's. Might be surprising, but exercise is the treatment with the most evidence to suggest it will slow down the disease.
The problem with it is we know that it's good for us, but still nobody does it, at least not as much as they should.
I won't be able to do the other things I want in my career, my family, my life in general, if I'm vegetated by age 50.
I am joined, as always, by Dr. David Hedges, and today we have special guest Dr. Kathleen McKee, who is not only an MD but has a master's in public health from Harvard University and is on the cutting edge of neuroscience research, as Dr. McKee works as the medical director of neuroscience research at Intermountain Health. So today we're going to be talking about Parkinson's. For those who don't know, and I might be one of these people, what even is Parkinson's, if you had to describe it to someone who doesn't know much about it?
Yeah, so Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease caused by death of dopamine neurons in the brain. Probably most people are familiar with the motor symptoms it produces, so tremor, slowness, stiffness, but it actually affects every organ system in the body, and people with Parkinson's can also have changes in mood, sleep, their GI tract, their autonomic system, blood pressure, urinary system. So that's Parkinson's in a nutshell.
So I understand you have some novel research where you're attempting to, well, you tell us how do you treat Parkinson's, right? Is like, what's going on with like the latest in that field of research?
Yeah, so I actually had a patient recently tell me they were so disappointed to discover that our best drug for Parkinson's was discovered in the 1960s, and it's still the best drug for Parkinson's. And so that drug is levodopa. It's the precursor to dopamine. And in Parkinson's, people don't make enough dopamine because they've lost those neurons. And so we give them back dopamine in through various medications. We also have surgical treatment that helps mitigate symptoms. But unfortunately, none of those drugs or surgical treatments slow down the progression of the disease. They treat symptoms, they help people feel better, but they don't slow down the disease. This is not for failed attempts to look for a cure. Or I guess I should say it's not for lack of attempts to look for a cure. There have been decades of trials looking at stem cell therapy and other molecular cures for Parkinson's, and we just have not found that cure. Meantime, what we do have is exercise, and might be surprising, but exercise is the treatment with the most evidence to suggest it will slow down the disease. And this is not just like, oh, you should exercise, it's good for you. Your doctor's always said, eat healthy, exercise. This is like, you will acutely feel better and the disease will progress more slowly. And so I think it's an even more serious recommendation for people with Parkinson's.
So, Kathleen, is this the only thing that's known right now that can slow down the disease progression? Because the way you describe Parkinson's disease, it's pretty disruptive to your life, your quality of life, and gets worse as the disease progresses. So does this exercise, does that actually effectively slow down disease progression?
So we're very close to saying that it definitely does. We have evidence from multiple different trials in different continents that all show the same thing with exercise. The trial that will definitively be able to say exercise slows disease progression is underway right now, called the SPARKS-3 study, looking at taking patients with Parkinson's and having them run on a treadmill at high intensity. And so that will definitively answer that question. But far and above, it has more promise than any of the other treatments that have been studied for slowing down the disease.
What does this mean? So, like, as we talk about, chronic disease, Parkinson's is one of those, as being one of the principal drivers of costs of medical services in the United States. But yet you're saying that, exercise can be an effective treatment. So what does that mean for the overall cost? I mean, we see, cost of treatment usually comes down to a lot of very expensive therapies, surgical therapies, or potentially, a lot of pharmaceutical or drug therapies, driving costs to the roof. What does that mean here? What you're saying is exercise can be prescribed to patients for an intervention that can delay disease progression. What does that mean for the economics of care for people with Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, Parkinson's disease kind of left to its own devices. Someone who doesn't exercise, maybe takes medication, goes to physical therapy once they're injured. Unfortunately, they will experience increasing disability and will end up in the hospital with pneumonia from aspiration, hip fractures from falling, and will have probably a not great last 15 to 20 years of their life, all of which is also very costly. Our hypothesis is that if we can get people exercising early in the course of their disease, they can slow down that progression so that they would have to be, 120 before they reach that state. We can slide that further down, keep them healthier for longer, make sure that into their 80s and 90s, they are still having great health and able to do the things they want to do. And so I see exercise and the prescription of exercise as a long-term investment. Acutely, it's probably going to cost a little bit more, not exorbitantly more, but a little bit more to implement this exercise because it's hard. It's hard to get people with Parkinson's who might not have an exercise background exercising at 80 to 85% of their heart rate max. That's going to take some money and infrastructure. But the long-term cost savings are huge. If we are keeping those people out of the hospital and alive and healthy longer, they will cost far less in the long run.
So this idea of exercise as an intervention, almost like a prescription, it's like the drug, right, is the exercise. Like, there's no secret that exercise is good for you, right? Like, it solves a lot of problems, apparently, right? It can help you avoid obesity, for example. And from what I've seen in the research that I've done, the problem with it is we know that it's good for us, but still nobody does it, at least not as much as they should. So is this going to fall victim to that? Like, are people like, okay, it can help my Parkinson's, but they just fail to develop a habit for whatever reason, and so the actual in-practice effect is pretty minimal? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I worry about it. But in my clinical experience, I think we have sort of this secret weapon. Our patients are amazing. They're generally highly motivated, and there's this extra benefit they get from exercise that keeps them coming back to stay adherent to their prescription. And that is, not only does exercise slow down the disease over the long term, but it provides immediate symptomatic benefit. And this has been published in the literature. And then you just seen it in my patients. They will tell you, I go into my spin class, kind of walking with a cane, tremoring, really having trouble with dexterity, buttoning my shirt. I do my hour-long spin class, high cadence, high intensity. My tremor subsides, my dexterity improves. There have even been studies showing that a single dose of high-intensity exercise mimics the same degree of benefit as a dose of carbidopa-levodopa. That's the medicine we give to replace dopamine. And so the exercise acts as a very powerful acute drug as well. And so that's where I think, obviously there's a huge literature on behavioral change and adherence to exercise. I think we might stand a chance of getting cohorts of Parkinson's patients to adhere to exercise for the long term because of this immediate benefit.
Yeah, I think that holds a lot of water, honestly. Have you seen that with the people you're working with, that they stick to it fairly easily then?
Absolutely. I've had some people that really change their whole lifestyle around it because they recognize that if they go a week without exercising, they're going to feel horrible. And so when they're looking for their next vacation, they want to make sure it's a place where they'll have access to a bike or treadmill because they don't want to feel worse on vacation than they do at home. The trick is getting people over that first hump, right? People who have maybe never been exercisers before, how do you get them through the painful butt when you first get on the bike? How do you get them through that so that they can experience that symptomatic benefit? Once you can get them to experience that benefit, they'll stick with it.
So you've mentioned, treadmill, spin class, a bike. Like, what kinds of exercise will lead to these benefits? I mean, like, you've kind of talked about some of the more aerobic benefits. Does that include like swimming, biking, running, or is this something that can be extended to, like lifting weights, that kind of thing? Like, what have you seen, like the scope of exercise?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So the prescription, which is actually, it's detailed in a paper I just published with Daniel Korkos in the Journal for Parkinson's Disease. There's really 4 categories to this prescription. The first one is aerobic, and that is the exercise that's going to slow down the disease. For that, we want 80 to 85% of heart rate max for at least 90 minutes per week. And what has been studied in the literature is treadmill training and cycling. There is no reason to think that as long as you're hitting your heart rate target, you couldn't achieve the same benefit with swimming or elliptical or rowing. But there are some very practical considerations. Swimming generally tends to have a lower heart rate. You have to probably have been a former high school or collegiate swimmer to be able to have the technique and know how to get your heart rate up that high in the pool. And same with the elliptical. You can do it, but if you go to the gym and look at people ellipticaling, they're kind of like, stroll in the park. You got to really push it. The beauty of treadmill training is that you're weight bearing your entire body. And so your heart rate becomes more elevated just because of that reason. So that's that first category, aerobic exercise. That is what we think will slow down the progression of the disease. Now, there are 3 other categories that don't slow down the disease, but you absolutely have to do them if you want to avoid frailty, if you want to be able to be out and about in the world in your 70s, 80s, 90s. And the first one is strength training. So that's, what you asked about, resistance training. And there's nothing magical or different about resistance training for people with Parkinson's versus the general population. You want to work all major muscle groups 2 to 3 times per week. And the prescription really should be customized depending on that person's baseline strength and amount of muscle mass. The next category is flexibility. That is super important to avoid injury and maintain function. And then the third category is one called neuromotor, which is balance, agility, and mobility. And this is kind of some of the like dynamic stuff you might, the football players do the step through the ladder on the field. We all need to be doing that as we get older. And I would say, we're talking about Parkinson's here, but that exercise prescription of the aerobic, the resistance training, the flexibility, and then the neuromotor, all of us need that. Like the 3 of us sitting here right now should really be doing all 4 of those components if we want to be really spry 90-year-olds.
Spry 90-year-olds. So there seems to be this trade-off. I don't know if it's a trade-off, so maybe help me understand this a little bit more, that some of the benefit you get from the exercise might just be a relief of symptoms, if I understand, but it can go beyond that to where you're actually mitigating the disease, or like can you actually like modify the disease, and to what extent? I want to understand that more.
We think so, and this gets into the nuances of why I sort of couched that answer earlier, is we think so, but we don't know for sure. So we know for sure that exercise mitigates symptoms. We can show that by measuring symptoms in a standardized way before and after one exercise session, or before and after 6 months of regular exercise. And that's been shown with multiple modalities of exercise. The reason we think it slows down the disease, but we aren't totally sure, is that there's a confounding effect of taking the medication. So once people are no longer drug naive and start to take medication to treat Parkinson's, it becomes a little harder to sort out what is truly slowing the disease. And so we've got these different exercise trials from different continents, which have all shown the same result, where the control group over 6 months gets worse in terms of their motor symptoms and the exercise gets better. What we really need to truly answer this question is a group of people who have not been exposed to drugs to treat Parkinson's and have them exercise versus not exercise. And then you've eliminated that confounding variable and you can say for sure, okay, this is truly altering the disease course. And so that is, Sparks 2 was a feasibility study, phase 2 feasibility study, looking at that. It hinted at disease modification, but it was underpowered to truly answer that question. Sparks 3, which is going on right now, PI Daniel Korkos, is going to answer that question for sure. So stay tuned. That trial should be done within the next 5 years. And meanwhile, we don't want to wait for the results of that trial. The benefits are so big. We're ready to do this now.
Interesting. Man, I feel like I really kind of want to lead into my own background in biochemistry and start talking about the mechanisms for what could be going on. And but I'm not going to, I think, because no one wants to hear that. But I do have a question. So something you alluded to earlier, being able to push that kind of that threshold of quality of life with, how that, as disease progresses to that point where you're no longer able to function. I've heard this referred to as health span in the past. And I've heard, previous interactions with you, Kathleen, I think you've talked about the concept of health span. I wonder if you might explain that kind of for everyone else, like what is health span and why should anyone, especially people who maybe may not have a disease, any kind of chronic disease or be aware of chronic disease, why should they care about health span?
Yeah, so I think all of us should care about health span, and I have recently become much more concerned with it. So we typically think of aging and disease as a progression of disability, and I think we really need to flip the script. We need to stop reacting to disability. We need to stop waiting till the hemoglobin A1C is 5.6 before saying, oh my gosh, diabetes, we've got to do something. We need to see that A1C go from 4.6 to 4.7 to 4.8 to 5.1, and we have to intervene there. And the same with things like falls and hip fractures and heart disease. Our whole health system is set up to react to disability after it happens. Flipping the script and talking about health span, we want and need to build a health system that keeps people healthy. And so health span can be thought of as the length of time that you are able to live doing the things that you want to do. And it has not been objectively defined. There has been a call in the literature for someone to come up with like a health span index where you could more objectively define it, which I think would be great. But for now, it's this concept of the length of time you live being able to do the stuff you want to do. And the only way we're going to prolong health span is to do that preventative medicine. If we're responding to disability and disease, it's too late. And so I think all of us should care about this because, what's the point of modern medicine if, medicine can keep us alive, can treat those pneumonias, treat those hip fractures. But if I'm stuck in a recliner for my 80s and 90s and can't go outside, can't hike, can't go to the grocery store, can't get on a plane, can't lift my luggage into the overhead bin, I don't know, that's not like a great quality of life. Like, yes, I am alive. Modern medicine has prolonged my lifespan. But what I really want is a long life and a long health span. And so I think we should be talking exclusively in terms of health span. And then obviously disability will still arise and we treat it. But so much of what we end up treating in the healthcare system could be eliminated if we would focus instead on prevention.
Totally. And with that, it is time for the 1 minute for 1%.
All right. Thank you, Rylan. So today's 1 minute for 1% is from Warren Buffett. There's an anecdote that Warren Buffett's private pilot asked him, gosh, you're really successful. How do you figure out what to prioritize? And Warren Buffett said, make a list of 25 things you want to do in your whole life. Rank it from most important to least important, and then step back, look at it. You can only do the top 5. You are kidding yourself if you think you can do all 25. And the hardest challenge in your life is going to be to not do the bottom 20, because obviously they're interesting enough to have made it onto your list. And so if you can only do 5 things, you have to decide, is investing in your health right now so that you can have a long health span going to be one of your top 5? If it is, I think you have a fighting chance of having a good health span. But you have to recognize in order to do it and do it right, something else probably has to go because there's only 5 spots at the top. Back to you.
It's giving me a lot of introspection thinking about that. Is my health top 5 objective in my life? I have to admit, although I care about being healthy and I take steps to being healthy, I don't know if prior to this conversation, if I would have labeled having a long health span and living a healthy life and put that in one of my top 5. However, in thinking while you were talking, it probably has to be, because to accomplish some of the other things that I would say are top objectives, I need to have that health and health span with me. So it's interesting to kind of approach it from that foundational level. And realistically, that's probably going to require a lifestyle shift from me. I spend way too much time sitting in front of a computer screen working. I probably need to figure out how to better regulate my life and better reflect that as a top goal, because you're absolutely right. I won't be able to do the other things I want in my career, my family, my life in general, if I'm vegetated by age 50. I really need to, it's something to think about. It's interesting.
And it's one of those things that like you might think about in your head, but really the actual act of writing it down comes in handy, because you might think, you might have an idea of what could be on that list, but then when push comes to shove, what is going to be those top 5? And I'm going to have to do that to find out. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that health span doesn't have to be on the top 5. I just think we too often kind of just get pushed through our life. And this book, 4,000 Weeks, really talks about being more intentional. Like, you might decide that right now you want to work really hard and you are going to let your health slide, and you're going to have a few drinks every night because it's like very pleasurable in the moment. You don't want to live to be 80. I think I totally respect that too. I think it's just much cooler if you call it out intentionally.
Interesting.
Excellent.
Lot for me to think about.